Aslamualikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala khatamil anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Amma ba'd, fa'udhu billahi minash shaytanir rajeem. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Ameen ya rabbal alameen. Brothers, those that are inshallah listening, if you come forward as close as possible inshallah, so that we're all feel the sense of brotherhood and we're all close together inshallah and we can benefit. If you remember, in the last lesson, this is a question and please somebody answer. What did we cover in the last lesson? Harun, you were here. Zakaria, you were here. If you remember, we discussed, I'll give you a hint, the early childhood of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So can you remember what we talked about? Any point about the early childhood of the Prophet? We've got a youngster at the back, mashallah, that has raised his hand. Come forward, come forward. We learnt about? Excellent. Excellent, mashallah. MashaAllah. MashaAllah. What's your name? Abdurrahman. MashaAllah. Abdurrahman, I think, is one of the youngest here, and he's given a great answer. Harun, inshallah, next time, you have to give a good answer. And Zakaria, you especially as well. Inshallah. Yes, excellent. So he gave a very good recap, MashaAllah, that we spoke about the early childhood of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, about how he was raised by a foster mother. Yeah, and we talked about how the Arabs, they would like to send their children in the deserts so that they could be raised in harsh environments so that they would be stronger. And we talked about how Halima Sa'adiyya looked after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and how much barakah and blessings she got whilst the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was with her. And we discussed a few things in a little bit of detail, and we also discussed the death of the grandfather of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam as well. Okay, so that was the summary of the early childhood of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now we are talking about the early manhood of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, from his early manhood, so from around the ages of 9 to 15 and in his early 20s, we don't have many stories. And similar to the explanations that we gave last time, the reasons for us not having many stories are the following. Number one, nobody was witnessing and recording the incidents at that time, because at the time, of course, the Prophet ﷺ is a young man, he's not yet the Prophet. So nobody knows this is going to be an important man in which all of his events should be recorded. Does that make sense? When I say it makes sense and you're nodding, inshallah, that means next week you should be able to give a recap, inshallah. Yeah. A couple of the other points. Nobody knew that he was, as I already mentioned, he was going to become a prophet of Allah. Also, there was no writing in Mecca. You know, we mentioned that the Prophet ﷺ was illiterate, and this was very common. In fact, in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, there were very few people that were able to read and write. Most people weren't able to read or write. So they couldn't capture the life of the Prophet ﷺ. Also, those who lived long enough to remember when the Prophet was a young man, there weren't many. So when Islam had been established and the Muslims were living in Medina and there was an era of peace, there weren't many alive that were old enough to remember, I remember when the Prophet was 18, 20, this such and such happened. This is why there's not many stories. However, there are a few stories that are authentically narrated and are written in the books of Seerah, in Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham. And these are the stories that we'll be discussing today. And the first thing I was going to mention is the job of the Prophet ﷺ. When the Prophet was a young man, what did he used to do to earn his livelihood? Correct, he was a shepherd. Yeah, as were the other prophets of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the first job, as authentically narrated in a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, Allah never sent a prophet except that he was a shepherd. And the companions asked the Prophet ﷺ, not even you, Ya Rasulullah. And subhanAllah, this shows that a lot of the companions, even they didn't know that the Prophet was a shepherd. Because a lot of the companions were young later in Islam, and they didn't know the Prophet was a shepherd in his young age. So, and they thought that the Prophet ﷺ perhaps would have been an exception. Yeah, because he's the best of creation. They thought maybe this is, too small of a job for the Prophet. He couldn't have been a shepherd. They didn't know. So they asked this question to him, even you, Ya Rasulullah. And the Prophet ﷺ said, I was, and I used to tend to the flock of the people of Mecca in return for some qararit. So qararit are pennies. So the Prophet ﷺ is describing to his companions that he came from humble beginnings. That he used to tend to the flocks of the people of Mecca, and all he would get in return were a few pennies. And this is sahih and authentically narrated. Without a doubt, the Prophet ﷺ was a shepherd, and he mentioned every other prophet was also a shepherd. And we'll mention in detail later on what are the wisdoms behind Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala making all of the prophets shepherds. There is hikmah in this, there's wisdom, which we'll go to in a little bit of detail. But before I do that, in another hadith, it said that the Prophet ﷺ saw some of the shepherds taking care of the sheep they had, and the Prophet ﷺ spoke to these shepherds and he said, I advise you to find the tree of arak and find the darker branches, as this will be better for your flock. So the Prophet ﷺ, in an authentic hadith, he is telling some other shepherds, he's giving them some advice, that if you do such and such, it will be better for your sheep. So what's that showing? It shows that the Prophet ﷺ was good at his job, and he gave good advice to some other shepherds. Now, these men, they were shocked, and they asked, how do you know this, Ya Rasulullah? How do you know about this piece of advice that you gave us that is good for being a shepherd? How do you know this? And the Prophet ﷺ replied, I used to be a shepherd, and every prophet of Allah used to be a shepherd. And in another narration, in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, the Prophet ﷺ is recorded to have said, Musa alayhi salam was sent to become a prophet when he was a shepherd. Dawood was sent when he was a shepherd. And I too was a shepherd in the valley of Ajad. So these are a couple of narrations to show the Prophet ﷺ grew up being a shepherd. So I alluded to the points about the hikmah and the wisdom behind why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose the Prophet to be a shepherd and all of the prophets to be a shepherd. And I'll summarize it in a couple of points. Number one, as a shepherd, you have the opportunity to be alone. Yeah? And when you're alone, what do? You contemplate, you reflect, you start thinking about things, you start critically thinking, and you start thinking about the wonders and the creations of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And taking your flock away from the hustle and the bustle and the busy lifestyle of the city, you are able to contemplate the purpose of existence. And this is what all the prophets did. When they were alone and they were with their flocks of sheep, they would remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and they would contemplate and reflect. And subhanallah, how many of you have been into nature? You might go to the Peak District or the Lake District or Wales, and you go on a little family holiday and it's really quiet. And at night time you look up in the skies, or even Dunstable Downs, very close here, and you look up in the sky and you see stars. Does it not remind you, and it makes you think about the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? When you're out in nature all by yourself, you start contemplating and reflecting about the blessings of Allah. So one of the wisdoms behind being a shepherd is Allah gives you this opportunity to do this. And subhanallah, it's no coincidence that those people who are so busy in their worldly lives, in the city, the world that we live, the 9-to-5 lifestyle, working, paying your bills, work, eat, sleep, we're like robots. Yeah. And those people who live that lifestyle, it's no coincidence that there's a lot more atheism in people like that. There's less people that believe in Allah, who have this busy lifestyle of trying to earn money, getting a bigger house, a bigger car. But those that live a simple lifestyle, there is no coincidence there that these people tend to be closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. People that live simpler lifestyles. So this is one of the wisdoms behind why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made the Prophet and the other prophets a shepherd. Another wisdom is that sheep are similar to men. What do I mean by this? Sheep need to be taken care of, or else they will go astray. Yeah? If a shepherd isn't looking after their sheep, the sheep will get lost. They'll go on the road, one will go in that direction, another will go over there, they'll get eaten by wolves, and they'll be attacked. Yeah? So sheep need to be taken care of, or else they would go astray. And another thing to add to that, each animal has its own unique personality. Not every sheep is the same. One sheep you have to be slightly softer with. Another sheep you have to show a little bit more aggression. And you have to tailor your approach to every single sheep. And the wisdom behind this is that each sheep has its own individual needs, and the shepherd has to adjust to each sheep. And the wisdom behind this is that when you have that experience, growing up being a shepherd, treating each sheep differently, guiding them, you can do the same thing with mankind. And the Prophet ﷺ developed these skills, learning how to take care of each individual person and tailor and adjust what's required based on the person's individual needs. SubhanAllah. And this is another wisdom. Another wisdom behind making the Prophet a shepherd is that being a shepherd gives you amazing qualities. And what qualities are these? On one hand, it makes you soft and tender. Because when you're looking after sheep or animals, you have to be soft and tender-hearted. But on the other hand, you must also be brave and courageous. Why? Because if any danger is there, for example, wolves are coming, you have to be brave and you have to quickly get your sheep together and protect them. So these attributes and traits the Prophet ﷺ got from being a shepherd. And this was very important for him in his later lifestyle. He needed to be tender-hearted and soft-natured, but also he needed to be courageous. And the Prophet ﷺ displayed this in his life. Our Prophet ﷺ himself said in a hadith, the people who own horses will be the ones full of pride. The people who own camels will be the ones full of arrogance. And the people who own sheep will be the ones full of humility and humbleness. SubhanAllah. So this again is a hikmah why the Prophet ﷺ used to herd sheep. And there's attributes that you see in people that do this. They have humility. SubhanAllah. A couple of more wisdoms and hikmah behind why the Prophet ﷺ was a shepherd. The fourth point I wanted to mention, it shows that the Prophet ﷺ understands that he needs to earn money. Even though he is a prophet of Allah SWT, Allah SWT didn't give him such an easy lifestyle that you sit there, you're a prophet and you don't do anything else. You don't have to work for anything. No, the Prophet ﷺ was a man. He was the best of men, but he was a man. And he realized that I need to earn a living for me to live my life. And this was an importance that the Prophet ﷺ also had a job. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala easily could have sent the Prophet without ever working, because he's the best of creation. But Allah is teaching the Prophet a lesson that, and this is an example for others, that whenever you want something, you have to work for it. And this is why the Prophet ﷺ wasn't a freeloader that relied on other people to give him money. No, he earned his own money. Another wisdom is to show the simple lifestyle of the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ came from humble beginnings. You know, being a shepherd is a very manual job. You know, it's not considered to be a high status job, like a businessman who brings home a lot of money. No, a shepherd is a very laborious job. And the Prophet ﷺ said, as we mentioned in the previous hadith, he only got a handful of pennies. And this shows the humble and simple lifestyle of the Prophet ﷺ, which he displayed in his whole life. And there's many examples that we'll go through in the seerah of how simple the Prophet ﷺ was, how simple his lifestyle was. He didn't fall into the luxuries of this world. And this is very important for us to learn from. And the last wisdom that inshallah I'll mention before moving on to the next topic is one of the wisdoms behind being a shepherd is to teach us the value of starting from the bottom and working our way up. You know, nothing in life is given to you and handed to you in a plate. You know, any successful person that you see, because the Prophet ﷺ, he had worldly success, and of course he'll have the greatest success in the hereafter, but he had worldly success because Islam spread so easily. But Islam didn't spread easily and fast like that. There had to be hardship in the beginning. And one of the wisdoms here is you start from the bottom and you work your way up. And this applies to anyone. Any successful businessman that you see, they didn't start off being born a billionaire. No. Most successful businessmen you see, they started from nothing. They started from humble beginnings. They grafted, they worked hard, they spent hours and hours working, and eventually they got their way up to the top. And this is a wisdom that the Prophet ﷺ started off as a simple shepherd. But in his lifetime, by the end of his life, Islam had spread throughout the whole Arabian Peninsula. And this is a very important lesson here. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually reminds the Prophet ﷺ in Surah Duha, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, your Lord has not abandoned you, nor has He become hateful of you. And the next life is certainly far better for you than this one. And surely your Lord will give you so much to you that you will be pleased. Did He not find you as an orphan, then sheltered you? Did He not find you unguided, then guided you? And did He not find you needy, then satisfied your needs? So do not oppress the orphan, nor repulse the beggar, and proclaim the blessings of your Lord. SubhanAllah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is reminding the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam about his humble beginning. Did your Lord not find you in this humble state? And He honored you. SubhanAllah. So these were some of the wisdoms behind why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chose all of the prophets, including the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to be a shepherd. Now the next thing I wanted to discuss is a story in the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And this occurred when the Prophet was around the age of 15 to 18. So he was a young man, but he wasn't old enough to be at the forefront in battle. So this story is a story of the Fijar Wars. Yes, so evil wars. So what is this story? The Fijar Wars is a series of small battles that broke out between two tribes of Arabia, Kinana and Qais Aylan. So these two tribes, they fought amongst each other in a battle called the Fijar Wars. Wars called the Fijar Wars. So what happened? The tribe of Quraysh belongs to a much larger tribe called Kinana. And we mentioned this a few weeks ago. So Quraysh belongs to Kinana. This is one group, so Kinana. The second group, another large branch, is called Qais Aylan. And this comprises of other smaller tribes that you will hear in the Seerah. Tribes like Ghatafan and Hawazin. So these tribes, they come from Qais Aylan. So Quraysh comes from Kinana, Ghatafan and Hawazin come from Qais Aylan. So these are the two larger tribes that fought in the Fijar Wars. So to make a long story short, this is what happened. A person from Kinana killed a man from Hawazin. So this is how the war started, yeah? Man from Kinana killed a man from Hawazin. So when Hawazin found out that Kinana has killed one of our men, they attacked the Kinana tribe to such an extent that they ran after them. And when they ran after them, including the Quraysh rushed back to Mecca. And why did they run to Mecca? They realized if we are in the Haram, no one is going to kill us. Why? Because everybody knew that for the sanctity of the Haram is holy, you're not allowed to kill anyone. And the Arabs used to honor this. And if somebody is in the Haram, you're not allowed to fight. So as a tactic, because Hawazin, a member of them, had been killed, they were running after Kinana. Kinana ran to the Haram so that they wouldn't be killed. But Hawazin was so angry that even though the group from Kinana were in the Haram, they still killed them. They still killed someone in the Haram. And this was blasphemous. It was such a major sin that even though Kinana were the first ones that started everything, they were the ones that killed a member from Hawazin. Hawazin here committed the bigger crime, because it was an even bigger crime to kill someone in the Haram itself. So when this happened, outrage happened. Everybody lost their minds. That how can Hawazin kill someone in the Haram? SubhanAllah. And attacking the sanctity of the Haram is the bigger crime than the original crime itself. So at the end of the story, what happened here is they began this whole series of wars. And this war is called the Wars of Fijar. Why? Fijar means evil. So both sides here committed evil. But the latter, the tribe of Hawazin, they committed the bigger crime here. So in this war, the Prophet ﷺ's job, what he used to do, is he used to pick up the arrows that people had missed. So this war had happened, and people were shooting arrows, and any arrows that missed its target, the Prophet would pick these arrows up and give it back to the soldiers. And this shows that the Prophet was young at the time. Why? Because if he was older, he would have participated in the battle himself. So that's why he was around 15 to 18 at the time. Yeah, so academically it makes sense. So the Prophet would pick these arrows up and he would give them to his uncles, who would be the soldiers in the battle. And in this battle, to summarize it, Quraysh was originally losing the battle. But the Prophet ﷺ, everything he touched, there was barakah in it. And because the Prophet participated, his uncles realized that there's barakah in whatever the Prophet ﷺ is doing. So they kept the Prophet with him and with them. And eventually the Quraysh won the war. Now it's recorded after Islam, when the Prophet ﷺ was much older, he recalled the Fijar wars and he mentioned something about them. And he said, I remember participating in the Fijar wars, and I would collect arrows for my uncles and hand them back to them. And I do not regret participating in that war. This is a very important point here, where he says, he's talking about something that happened in the past. And then he says, I don't regret it. Why did he say, I don't regret it? Because there was no Islam at that time. There was no Ummah at that time. He had not yet revealed prophethood. Prophethood had not yet been revealed to him. But he still says, even though there was no Muslim and non-Muslim, even though he's recalling that, he's remembering and he's saying, I don't regret it. And inshallah, before we end today, I'll come back to this point and mention the benefits of this. The last story, before we inshallah wrap up the benefits of the stories, is a story called Hilf al-Fudul. So Hilf al-Fudul, this happened when the Prophet ﷺ was around 20 years old. So what happened here? The pact, Hilf al-Fudul is a pact. Yeah, it was a pact. And what's a pact? It's like a promise, when people get together and promise something. So this pact occurred in Dhul Qa'dah, and this is one of the sacred months, and it took place in Mecca. And what happened, to summarize the story, a person from the tribe of Zubayd, this is a tribe from Yemen. And he was in, this person from Yemen, he was in Mecca, and he sold a number of items to one honored member of the Quraysh, Al-As ibn Wa'il. And this is actually the father of Al-Amr ibn al-As. So when we study the life of the Prophet ﷺ, we will hear about the story of Amr ibn al-As. He was a very famous companion. So his father, Al-As ibn Wa'il, he was the one that had been sold. So he was the one, that sold, that bought a number of items from this man from Yemen. So because Al-As ibn Wa'il was a chieftain, and he was a very honorable member of the Quraysh, and he was respected, he was a rich businessman, he told this man from Yemen, I'll give you the money after Hajj before you go back to Yemen. So he goes, even though I bought some goods from you, I'm not going to give you the money just now. Just after you finish Hajj and go back to your hometown, I'm going to give you the money then. So this man, he performs his Hajj, and then he comes back to Al-As and he said, remember, you said to me, after I finish Hajj and before I go to Yemen, you're going to give me my money for what you bought from me. And Al-As says, come back tomorrow. And so this man comes back the next day and he says the same thing again. Al-As says, come back tomorrow. I'll give you the money tomorrow. He keeps delaying it. So this keeps happening until the man realizes that this is a trick. Al-As is not going to give me my money. Yeah, so even though he's bought goods from me, he's not giving me my money. So this man, he feels wronged and he realizes he's not going to get his money back. So he goes to all the sub-tribes of Quraysh and he starts begging them for help. He goes to Banu Hashim, he goes to Banu Abd-Dar, and he goes to all of these tribes and he says, can you please plead on my behalf and speak to Al-As so I can get my money? You know, I sold him some goods and he owes me. Can you please give my money back? And essentially, all of these tribes, they make an excuse. Why? Because they know Al-As. They know he's an honorable man. Not honorable, a famous man. He's a famous man. He's got high status. He's a rich businessman. He's a politician. They don't want to get in his bad books. So they end up making excuses for Al-As. All these sub-tribes. They say, oh, don't worry. And they basically ignore this Yemeni man. So this man, he feels completely trapped. and he says, what can I do here? Al-As owes me money. I've gone to all of these sub-tribes and nobody is giving me my money. So because he feels completely trapped, he decides to make this public. So what he does, he goes out in public and he starts reciting a poem in front of everyone. And in this poem, I'll actually read the poem. He says, O family of Fihr, Quraysh, I am one who has been unjustly treated because of my merchandise. I am in the valley of Mecca, far away from my home and away from people to protect me. I am still in my ihram. My hair is not combed, nor have I finished my umrah. Where are my men to help me? Between the Hijr and the Hajar, so Hijr where Ismail alayhi salam was, and the Hajar, the stone, you are doing this to me. The true haram belongs to those who are noble. There is no sanctity to the one who wears a thobe while he is a traitor. So this man is announcing this poem in front of everyone. And this is very dishonorable for the people of Quraysh. That this man is making us look bad. That we've done him wrong and nobody is doing anything about it. So when he recited this poem, Az-Zubayr ibn Abdul Muttalib, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ, he said something has to be done now. This man has said a poem and everyone has heard this poem. Something has to be done. So he got a gathering of all the senior members of the Quraysh in the house of Abdullah ibn Jud'an. So Abdullah ibn Jud'an, he was a very honorable man and he was a distant uncle of Aisha radiallahu anha, and he was considered to be the most noble of people of Mecca in terms of hospitality and genuine sincerity. He was a very good man, Abdullah ibn Jud'an. So all of the people gathered in the house of Abdullah ibn Jud'an and they agreed to a treaty. And in this treaty, they said that they will side with the oppressed against the oppressor regardless of their tribe. Even if the one who is shown injustice is from a faraway tribe and the oppressor is from Quraysh. So they basically said here that no matter which tribe you're from, if someone is being oppressed, we're going to side with them. Yeah, before this wasn't normal. Why? Because people would get away with it. If they were part of Quraysh, they would get away with whatever they wanted. But because this man said a poem in front of everyone, they done a treaty here, and they said, if somebody is oppressed, we're going to side with them. So it was a good thing that they done. So all of them went to the Kaaba, and they signed a document. So obviously in those days, they couldn't read or write. Yeah, they didn't used to have pen and paper. So they didn't sign the document. So the way that they would agree to a treaty is they would dip their hands in perfume. And this is why another name for Hilf al-Fudul is Hilf al-Mutayyibin. So I'll explain that in a second. So they dipped their hands in perfume and they rubbed the perfume on the Kaaba. And Hilf al-Mutayyibin is the treaty of the perfume. Yeah, so the treaty of the perfume. This is another name given to Hilf al-Fudul. So the treaty of those who have perfumed themselves. That's what Hilf al-Mutayyibin means. And the other name, Hilf al-Fudul, is also called that. Why? Because when Al-As heard this, about this whole story, he said, why did they have to get involved in a matter that is fuduli? That's none of their business. And that's why it's called Hilf al-Fudul. So when he heard they've signed a treaty and they're going to sign with the one that's been oppressed, he said these words. Why do they have to get involved in a matter that is fuduli? None of their business. And this is where the word Hilf al-Fudul comes from. And to wrap it up, inshallah, the Prophet ﷺ said in a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, I witnessed in the house of Abdullah ibn Jud'an a treaty that were I asked to uphold it even in Islam, I would do so. And I would not be willing to give up my place for a lot of red camels. Meaning that the Prophet ﷺ here is saying, he was very happy that he was part of this treaty. And even if somebody gave him so much money, red camels were worth a lot of money. He said even if someone was to give him a lot of money, he wouldn't give up his position in his treaty. And he ﷺ said, in that treaty, they all agreed that the rights would be given back to the one who deserves them, and that no oppressor would have an upper hand over the ones who is oppressed. SubhanAllah. So the Prophet here again, similar to Fijar wars, the Prophet here is saying, I remember that treaty, Hilf al-Fudul, and it was such an honorable treaty. And the Prophet is showing here that he was happy that he was part of that treaty. So inshallah, to finish today, what were some of the lessons from Fijar wars and Hilf al-Fudul? Number one, and inshallah, there's only 4 points I'm going to mention, and then we'll finish for today, inshallah. Number one, the Prophet ﷺ didn't regret participating in the wars of Hijaz. So the wars of Hijaz, this was not a religious war. It wasn't about Islam versus mushrikeen or getting rid of all the mushrikeen. This was not a war about that. But the Prophet ﷺ remembers this war and he was happy about the war. Yeah? So what does that show? There's some fiqhi maslaha here that some scholars, as a matter of fiqh, they say that it is permissible to participate in battles and wars sometimes that aren't necessarily about religion, if there's khair and goodness in them. If you're doing something for the right reasons and you're doing something to give justice to people, even if it's not got to do with Islam, some scholars say it's permissible. Why? Because of this hadith about the Fijar wars. Number two, the incident of Hilf al-Fudul shows that the Prophet ﷺ was actively involved with his society. This is a very, very important point here. Why? Because we as Muslims, sometimes we think that we can't get involved with non-Muslims when it comes to doing good work. For example, charity work. Or any good work. For example, trying to help homeless people. Yeah? Or trying to help disabled people. Or trying to do youth work. Or trying to do any sort of charity work. Some Muslims feel that we should only be doing this sort of work with Muslims, not with non-Muslims. But the Prophet ﷺ remembered Hilf al-Fudul and he was happy with Hilf al-Fudul. And the Prophet was participating in Hilf al-Fudul with people who are not Muslim, with mushrikeen. But he says it was a good thing. Why? Because what they were doing was a very noble thing. And this shows that we have to be actively involved in our society. And it's completely okay, and in fact it's encouraged, that whenever good work is being done, be involved in your community. Even if it's not with non-Muslims. In fact, perhaps it's a good thing to do with non-Muslims. Why? Because it's a form of da'wah. When you're doing good work with non-Muslims and you're telling them that this is part of our religion, this is a form of da'wah. So in your workplaces, in your schools for the youngsters, or your college, if there's any good work that's being done, and it's being run by non-Muslims, get involved in it. Do some charity work. Give blood to those who need blood. Yeah, so all of the good deeds that you can do it and get actively involved in your community, because the Prophet ﷺ was actively involved in his community. And this is very important. And the last couple of points, number three, it clearly demonstrates the status of the Prophet ﷺ. What do I mean by that? The Prophet was called to be a witness to this treaty of Hilf al-Fudul when he was just 20 years old. So what does that show? It shows that the Prophet was honored. He was only a 20-year-old man, and the Quraysh saw the Prophet ﷺ to be a future leader. Now he's only 20 years old, but he's been asked to be a witness to Hilf al-Fudul. So this shows the promise that the Quraysh had in the Prophet ﷺ, demonstrating that he is going to be a leader when he grows up. And the last learning point about the stories mentioned today that I'm going to mention is, despite all of the differences and problems that the Quraysh had, they still had some good traits. You know, when we talk about the Quraysh, especially when Islam had spread towards the end of the life of the Prophet, sometimes when we talk about the Quraysh, we only ever mention bad things. That the Quraysh, they were complete jahil, they were ignorant, they used to do idol worshipping. But sometimes it's important to recognize they also had good qualities. And what were their good qualities? They had characteristics of nobility and virtue. These mushrikeen, they done a good thing. In Hilf al-Fudul, they done a good thing. Why? They got together, they recognized someone is being treated unfairly, they got together and they done a good act. And because of this, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent the Prophet ﷺ in their midst to revive these very virtues. And they had some good traits, and this is why a lot of people accepted Islam from Quraysh. Why? Because they already had good traits. And when Islam came and Wahy came to the Prophet ﷺ, they recognized that the message of Islam is good. And those things that we do good, it is in line with Islam and the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. And that wraps up today's session, inshaAllah, about the early manhood of the Prophet ﷺ. Any good I said came from the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Any mistakes came from myself and shaitan. Jazakallah khair wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.